Alright, sorry for this video being delayed. I actually recorded it earlier, but it already didn't work, so here we're going to try again. But this will officially be the last video, no more after this. Alright, so new voices in society. As feminism found its foothold in the world that emerged after the two world wars, so did many other political, intellectual, and social movements. As individuals became more empowered, new voices found a place in European society. Environmentalism and green parties. By the 1960s, the rapid industrialization of the previous century had created significant environmental problems. Environmentalists argued that Europe was bound for ecological disaster if it failed to adopt practices that were more sustainable. They challenged the traditional economic and political establishment to adopt policies that were sensitive to the environment. This movement included not only environmental conservation, but also broader issues of lifestyle. The oil crisis of 1973, for example, in which a ban on oil trade drove down fuel supplies and drove up prices, helped spark the European environmental movement. To try to gain a voice in political policy, environmentalists formed green parties, political parties whose main focus is on the environment or ecology-oriented ideals. Such parties began to form in the 1970s. An umbrella organization known as the European Greens was founded in Brussels, Belgium in January of 1984. The first and most successful Green Party was Die Grünen, founded in West Germany primarily by Herbert Gruhl and Petra Kelly in 1979. The party was formed by a collective of roughly 250 separate environmental groups. Its primary goal was to rally public support around the issues of nuclear energy and pollution. By the end of the 1980s, almost every country in Western and Northern Europe had its own version of the Green Party. Other political and social movements. Several other movements rose alongside the feminists and Greens after World War II. Though the groups all had different aims, each was fighting for some sort of social change. Most of the movements saw some degree of success, though some brought about more change than others. Youth revolts in 1968, A generation that had experienced neither an economic depression nor total war came of age in the 60s. It was also the first generation to grow up under the threat of nuclear destruction. The combination of forces creates tension between older and younger people around the world, known as the generation gap. As a movement, young people criticized existing institutions and beliefs while also calling for greater political and personal freedoms. Students felt that leadership, either of their governments or educational institutions, was more interested in global security than in providing opportunity. In this period, for the first time, echoes from the United States had an important effect on student action in Europe. Several events led to massive student unrest in 1968. The year opened with young people in Czechoslovakia protesting against Communist Party rule. Their action there inspired movements in Rome and Paris. In France, the May students' revolts against consumerism, capitalism, and traditional values sparked labor strikes as well, with 11 million workers walking off their jobs. Other student outbreaks soon followed, from London to Yugoslavia. The student movements produced few immediate concrete gains, but they raised awareness of persistent class divisions that seemed to prevent real democracy from taking hold in Europe. The students' efforts also highlighted gender divisions that would spark the women's movement. Gay and lesbian movements. Organized movements for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender are now also key, with the questioning people have started after other movements in Europe, but individuals in this group had a long history of struggle. Discrimination was widespread and legal. Aversion therapy, or the practice of attempting to rid an individual of homosexual tendencies, was practiced in most Western countries from the 1950s through 60s, often using painful electric shock therapy. In France, the beginning of the gay liberation movement is commonly identified as May 1st, 1971. A small group of protesters interrupted France's popular May Day celebrations. A decade later, in 1981, there was mass demonstrations against laws that supported discrimination against LGBTQ people. Since 1995, gays and lesbians have obtained full legal rights throughout Europe, although social rights have not been achieved everywhere. Immigrants as targets. Because of the economic growth of the 1950s and 60s, many guest workers from Southern Europe, Asia, and Africa immigrated to Western and Central Europe. After the economic downturn in the 70s, these workers and their families often became targets of anti-immigrant agitation and extreme nationalist political parties. In France, for example, the right-wing National Rally political party supports French nationalism and controls on immigration, and has been accused of encouraging xenophobia being the intense fear or dislike of people from other countries, and anti-Semitism. The Freedom Party of Austria, founded in 1956, also argued for stricter controls on immigration and has warned against the over-foreignization of Austrian society. Okay, next slide. All right, European integration. After decades of global conflict, several factors contributed to European countries' desire for greater cooperation. For the French in particular, such cooperation was a means to keep an eye on Germany, a country that occupied it twice in the 20th century. There was also a growing sense that economic rationalization and cooperation were needed to end wasteful competition and ease tensions between nations. Concerns about the Soviet Union further encouraged unity. Steps to unified Europe. After World War II, Europeans took explicit steps towards reducing nationalism. The measures European leaders put in place were designed to promote both economic and political integration. Leaders hoped that integration would lead people to see peace as in their self-interest. Further, these measures tried to change how people thought about themselves. The goal was to establish a shared European identity. Just as the development of nationalism in the 19th century had overcome regional divides, internationalism might overcome national divides. And all this we've already addressed in different ways. We talked about how the Marshall Plan brought in $13 billion from the United States to help rebuild Europe, which kind of helped start this process. The first step in unification was the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, or the OEEC. It was established to help administer the Marshall Plan funds. Not long after that, you have the European Coal and Steel Community created, the ECSC, which involved those original 6 countries: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. That led to the creation of the European Parliament that helped run the ECSC. It also ran a court as well and collected tax income. The main architect of the ECSC was Robert Schuman of France, who hoped that it would make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. And a few years later, they dissolved that and created a new organization called the European Economic Community, more commonly called the Common Market. Same 6 countries. Britain, Ireland, and Denmark joined the EEC in 1973. They lifted almost all trade restrictions among the member states. In 1986, the Single European Act allowed citizens to move freely among the member nations. And then in 1991, you get the Maastricht Treaty, which helps establish the European Union, and also helps create the new currency of the euro. The treaty also allowed European nations to cooperate in areas such as security and environmental affairs, and it also resulted in a name change from the EEC to the European Union. And finally, you get modern Europe. Membership in the EU became a perpetual balancing act. People in each country had to weigh the benefits against the cost. EU membership provided countries with many advantages. For example, tax-free trade allowed businesses to sell their products more easily in a wider market. Free movement for citizens across borders made travel for work and tourism easy. Sharing a common currency made every financial transaction simpler. Greater political cooperation made addressing cross-border problems such as pollution more effective. These advantages help explain why Europe under the EU had its most peaceful and prosperous period in many centuries. However, many countries dislike some of the restrictions on their autonomy. For example, no member could use the death penalty. Wealthier countries sometimes resented helping support poorer ones. Economic integration brought greater stability and prosperity overall, but it also meant that an economic problem in one country could have greater impact on the other countries. Further, some countries feared the loss of their own distinct culture. They wanted to protect their language and their traditions from becoming just part of a general European one. Another difficulty member nations faced was determining if or when how to leave. In 2016, British citizens voted to exit the EU. This move became known as Brexit. Negotiations between Britain and the rest of Europe over separation proved very complicated. It's still going on. Really don't know what's going to happen. And that's it. You're done with Euro history. Congratulations.